Okay, so now I want to introduce Dr. Bob Knight. He's with the Florida Springs Institute, and we're thrilled to have him here. I think he's also taking his vacation here today, too. It's only Dave that's not vacationing today. Dr. Knight was with us in May, if some of you were with us for our big Groundwater Guardian workshop, and I'm sure this is also going to be just as inspiring. I was thrilled to hear him. It's the first time I've heard him speak was this May, but he comes highly recommended, and he's highly passionate about springs protection. I think you'll see that in just a moment. And his daughter, Emma Knight, is here. You would raise your hand, Emma? And so we're thrilled to also, start this in another generation of how important it is in another generation of people to start protecting this valuable resource. With that, Dr. Knight, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you. I don't need that one.
Oh, you don't?
I'm wired.
Matter of fact, you can.
Wired. I think he's going to shock me whenever I say the wrong thing. Hopefully not. Thank you very much, Alice, for inviting me today. And I'm always pleased to be with Harley and Dave. I learn from them every time I hear them speak also. And so thank you for your presentations and taking off, too. Let me see if I can figure this out. That's the pointer, and this is the advance. I'd like to make it a little more general. I'm going to talk about some other parts of the state other than the Southwest Florida Water Management District, as well as some local issues. They've set the stage for me very well in terms of what I want to talk about. I want to really talk about how much water do springs need, and how can we do a better job of ensuring that in the future. And not just the amount of water, but the quality of water. Springs are dependent on both clean water and abundant water, as we are too, by the way. So I want to define what a healthy spring ecosystem is as far as we know in Florida. It's hard to find a healthy spring in Florida now. I'm very ashamed to say I started my work in springs in the 70s and had no idea how bad things were going to be by the current decade. And I've decided to devote my retirement to defending springs, and that's what I do. I started the nonprofit Florida Springs Institute as a way of trying to pick up the slack that the state has left in terms of protecting springs. And we have great state employees with us today, but the political science that rules things sometimes doesn't let the good technical people do the job they know that needs to be done. And so that's what I can do. I don't work for the state. I don't work for anybody, actually. I just work for free for the Florida Springs Institute and for the Springs of Florida. And I want to talk about these problems. I wish I had an uplifting talk with all good news, but we don't, and maybe that's why some of you are here today, is because you already know that. I want to talk about what is sustainable development in Florida. What would it take to restore our springs to a sustainable level, a level that we could all be proud of into the future, and for our children, our grandchildren, what are they going to think of us if Weeki Wachee Springs dries up or becomes so polluted that you can't see the bottom? What do we need to do that's different to make that future a possibility? And it's coming more and more into focus for me as I work in springs. This is a picture of Silver Springs, an artist's rendition of Silver Springs from the 1950s. This is what we think a healthy spring looks like. This Silver, the largest spring in the state of Florida, formerly, no longer, had the largest flow of any spring in the world, as far as we know, in terms of a long-term flow record, was the main tourist attraction in Florida in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Up until the time of Disney World, Silver Springs was what tourists came to Florida for. How many people have been to Silver Springs in the room? Well, just about everybody. And you can go around the world, and almost everybody, well, a lot of people in the world that have traveled know about Silver Springs. And this is what the healthy springs looks like. They've got macrophytic vegetation, or large plants we call eelgrass. They have lots and lots of fish, lots of turtles, a lot of birds dependent on this aquatic ecosystem, very clear water, abundant water, high flows. And that's what we think a healthy spring looks like. And we've been monitoring springs, including Weeki Wachee, and we find out that a vast number of our springs aren't healthy anymore with these attributes. They don't have the clean water. They don't have as much water. They don't have as many plants as they used to, and the plants that they have are mostly algae now rather than these eelgrass aquatic plants that are the natural plants in springs. And even the springs that still look good are trending and degrading in quality. And so that's causing ecological effects. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not a geologist, I'm an ecologist, I'm an aquatic ecologist. I study this, and so this is what I'm mostly interested in. The plant communities, this is in Rainbow Springs. The fish communities, this is Silver Glen Springs, one of our uncontaminated springs in the state, in the Ocala National Forest. These are striped bass and Silver Glen. A small turtle that's adapted to spring systems. Manatees, of course, are symbolic with the Springs coast and all our springs along the coast here. This is the natural ecology that I think is what makes us all really love springs. In fact, I don't know anybody that hates springs. I don't think anybody is destroying springs on purpose. It's because of other things, and usually because of ignorance, that people are destroying springs. And there's economic benefits of springs that we really haven't talked about. Just the springs in the state parks and publicly owned springs generate over $300 million a year in direct economic revenue. Direct, I mean, we're talking about many thousands of jobs that are dependent on these springs. If we don't have healthy springs, we lose a major part of our economy in Florida. Weeki Wachee, of course, Ichtucknee on a Memorial Day weekend is loved to death, almost literally. Alexander Springs, cave diving, kayaking. Everybody in Florida has a kayak now. I'm surprised. You know, it used to be 3 cars in every garage, and now it's 3 kayaks in every garage. And people love these spring runs for kayaking. Hoping to do a little bit of that today, right, Alice? On the Weeki Wachee. Well, the Springs Institute started issuing Springs report cards where there was enough data on springs. This is the most recent one, the first one actually for Silver Springs. Got a C+. And so we're looking at different indices that we can measure in these springs. The flow rate, the nitrate contamination, the amount of plants, the turtles or fish populations, the productivity of the whole ecosystem. And we're giving them grades based on sort of comparing them to what a pristine spring would be. So for flow, Silver Springs got an F. The flow in Silver Springs right now, actually during last year, was 50% of the long-term average flow of Silver Springs, 50%. The actual daily flow now at Silver is at a record low, never been lower. We're in a drought, and it's a long-term drought, but obviously we're pumping a lot of water, and I'll get into that in a minute. Water clarity is still high in Silver and in Weeki Wachee, so Silver got an A+ for that, and Weeki Wachee would too. Nitrate, Silver got an F. Silver, the nitrate in Silver is over 3,000% higher than it was historically. At Weeki Wachee, it's 20 times higher than it was historically. It's 3 times higher than the impaired level, but it's actually 20 times higher than it was historically. So those things are scary, and that's not the kind of report card we'd like to see. What we want to do, though, is see enough monitoring going on in springs so we know if they're getting better or they're getting worse. Unfortunately, we're in a time when the dollars for monitoring springs is being cut, and so there's less and less work being done in springs to even tell us about their health. 2 big issues you've heard about from the previous speakers. We have declining flows in our springs, and that's the first issue. And those are being caused by, obviously that. Groundwater consumption is increasing. Groundwater levels are falling because we're consuming groundwater, and spring flows are declining. The misunderstanding that people have, 2 things that I don't think were pointed out adequately by the previous speakers are, one is the Florida aquifer may be 1,000 feet thick in some areas. It's only the top part that's fresh water that you can use. It's not the whole Florida aquifer. And so there's water down over 1,000 feet, like under the Green Swamp, but a lot of that's salty water down below. So the top water is fresh. Well, we've got hundreds of feet of fresh water. Well, that doesn't do us any good, because if we pump down the aquifer by as little as 5, 10, 20 feet, we'll stop the springs from flowing. The springs are running off the top. They're creaming the top off of that aquifer. It's just the top of the aquifer that drives the springs. And we've seen during those historical low sea level times, none of these springs flowed. They were caves. The Indians were living in some of them. They were actually inhabited by humans. And they will stop flowing again if we pull the top of the aquifer down as little as, in some areas, 5 or 10 feet. At Silver, the aquifer level adjacent to Silver Springs right now is only 6 feet above the spring level. So if you just pull the aquifer down 6 more feet in several miles around Silver Springs, Silver would stop flowing, the biggest spring in the world. And that's what it takes. And that's a lot of water, but it still can be done. And we are doing it, and we're contributing to it. Low rainfall is a very difficult thing for springs. They have naturally low flows during low rainfall periods. But if you add pumping on top of that, we exacerbate a problem. It's a double whammy for springs. And we are increasing pumping. We saw some numbers. The total use is estimated to be 4.2 billion gallons a day. This is an estimate. It's a very uncertain estimate in parts of the state. Luckily, Southwest Florida Water Management District actually requires big users to report how much water they use. We don't require that in North Florida. Suwannee River District, Northwest Florida Water Management District, and even the St. Johns District, many of our biggest users aren't reporting their water use. So these are estimates. These are water use increases just for public supply since 1950. Anybody that thinks that pumping's not having an effect is, just loco, because pumping is having an effect. We're pumping more all the time. The other thing I wanted to emphasize that wasn't emphasized by the earlier speakers is that all the rainfall that recharges the Florida aquifer, essentially all of it, used to come out at springs. If it would rain, a certain amount of 10 to 20 inches a year would recharge in areas like this, and it would all come out at Weeki Wachee Springs, in the spring shed that was feeding Weeki Wachee Springs. Any water that we pump out of the ground and don't put back in the ground no longer comes out of Weeki Wachee Springs. It's a one-for-one deal. If you take a gallon of water and irrigate it and lose it through evaporation on your lawn, that's one less gallon that comes out of Weeki Wachee. If you take 100 gallons or 1,000,000 gallons, that's less water that comes out of Weeki Wachee. And so far, up until the 70s or so, we couldn't even notice that effect on the springs. There's so much water that recharges in Florida. But it's becoming more noticeable because we're in this upper part of the curve where our water uses are expanding exponentially. The total groundwater use in the water management districts other than South Florida, this is South Florida, but these 4 water management districts where the springs are, is about 2.3 billion gallons a day. It's been estimated the total flow of all the springs is somewhere between maybe 10, 15 billion gallons a day. So it's very possible right now that we're taking over 10% of all the groundwater that used to flow out of springs, about 10%. And there's a lot of evidence that indicates a significant harm occurs to springs at a reduction of about 10% of the flow. So over all the springs in Florida, it's at least my opinion right now that we're at a point where everything we're seeing, all the additional increases in flow are contributing more and more to harm that's very visible. The Southwest Florida Water Management District pumps almost 1 billion gallons a day on average. And I think it was mentioned that there's probably more pumping during dry years than in wet years, although water restrictions will help. Okay, the Florida Aquifer System, let me give you an example of one of these systems where this has been studied a lot. This is the Suwannee River in North Florida. These are springs. There's over 260 artesian springs along the Suwannee River and its tributaries, the Santa Fe, the Ichetuckney, the upper Withlacoochee. This is a spring-fed river. The Suwannee River that we think of being dark and everything, the majority of the flow in the Suwannee River is spring flow. Same thing in the Santa Fe River. Over half the flow, the base flow in these rivers, well, all the base flow and over half of the average flow is spring flow. We're pumping about 245 million gallons a day in the Suwannee River Water Management District. That's 10% of the flow. Now, some of this water returns, so this isn't definitely a 10% decrease in the Suwannee River, but it's a large part of that. It's probably 5 to 10% of the flow in the Suwannee River is already being pumped. But what's happening outside the spring shed, and this was a question that came up about one area pumping more water than another. Well, if you pump in South Georgia or Northeast Florida, like in Jacksonville, you pull down the aquifer a lot more because there's very little recharge in those areas. And so they have a big effect on groundwater levels. This is actually the drawdown in the Florida aquifer, recently plotted by the U.S. Geological Survey at a bunch of wells at distance. This is over in Jacksonville, Duval County, moving towards the Suwannee River. And the decline over here is as much as 40 feet in the surface of the aquifer. And remember what I said, how many feet it takes to pull down the water to stop a spring from flowing? They don't have any springs in Jacksonville anymore. They used to have flowing wells all through Jacksonville. They haven't flowed in years because the aquifer is easily pulled down over there. That effect in the Northeast Florida area and South Georgia area is decreasing the spring shed that feeds the Suwannee River. This is the historic spring shed that is thought to have fed the Suwannee River that created that 2.4 billion gallons a day of spring flow. That has declined by 1,900 square miles since the 40s. And so in the past 70 years, 1,900 square miles, that's equivalent to a reduction in recharge that feeds the Suwannee River of 130 million gallons a day. That's similar to what's being pumped in these areas right now. In other words, there's big paper mills. You got the city of Jacksonville pumping about 70 million gallons a day. You got paper mills up the coast. You got farms in this area. So in addition to that 240 million gallons a day being pumped in the Suwannee River District, there's another 130 million gallons a day that never comes to the district anymore that used to. They got big problems in North Florida. Over 13 municipalities and county governments now have joined together to try to figure out what to do about this. They've set up an organization, Florida Leaders Organized for Water, and it's called FLOW. And they were thinking about suing Jacksonville to try to get them to reduce their pumping and their impacts on the Florida aquifer that was affecting the Suwannee River Springs. A part of that same example, Ichetuckney. How many people have been to Ichetuckney? Not as many as Silver. Well, you got to get up to Ichetuckney. It's still flowing. It's still a good place to tube. But its flow is down too for the same reason. This is the spring shed in Columbia County that feeds the Ichetuckney River. That spring shed's about 371 square miles, and there's about 13 inches of recharge. So the average flow is about 236 million gallons a day in the Ichetuckney River. That's a very big first magnitude spring. The decline, though, is estimated at 35 million gallons a day because of the pumping in Jacksonville area and in South Georgia. That's what USGS has estimated the average decline in the Ichetuckney is from those outside influences. So about 15%, the Ichetuckney flow is down 15%, and that's attributed mostly to pumping outside of the spring shed. And the way I put it is we're all in the same Slurpee cup. And there's this big gorilla over in Jacksonville sucking harder than the smaller apes over in Alachua County where I live can suck. I mean, whoever sucks the most can actually tip these groundwater divides between spring sheds. And so it may not be Miami that's sucking you dry here, but it could be the Tampa area and other big users, water users that are pulling off of near your spring shed that are not taking your water per se, but your water no longer is coming to you because the divide between the different spring sheds is moving. We have a lot of evidence of that now in Northeast Florida, and I suspect it's happening down through the central part of the state. This is what a spring looks like when it stops flowing. This was not a first magnitude spring, this was a second magnitude spring, 70-some CFS historic record. This is at White Springs at the state park at White Springs. And this is an old spring house that was built in the 30s, 20s. There are pictures of this spring house with hundreds of people in it. And basically, a spring, when it stops flowing, becomes a sinkhole. And it's not a pretty sight, especially when your town is named after the spring, White Springs, Florida, and they're members of FLOW. They would like to sue about this. But probably the biggest impact on this spring is a phosphate mine right next to the spring that's pumping a very large volume of water that's also in denial about its effect on the aquifer. So that's the first big problem. The second big problem is, okay, let's at least keep water in springs, but let's not have it so polluted. And our water in our springs is polluted with nitrate. This is a map of Florida. You've seen several maps of Florida. Remember where the karst areas are near the surface and the vulnerable areas? Well, those are the same areas that are contaminated with nitrate nitrogen. These are the areas where if you put fertilizer in the ground, if the plant doesn't take it up, which plants never take it all up, then that fertilizer gets into the groundwater, the drinking water. And this is a map of the aquifer nitrate levels for all of Florida during the period from 2000 to 2004. There's tens of thousands of well data points in here. And this is a blow up of Hernando County. And you can see which part of the county. You know, the reason Weeki Wachee Springs has high nitrate is because it's in this plume of high nitrate groundwater. There are areas like under that ridge that are confined that don't have much nitrate in the groundwater because the nitrate never gets through the confining layer. It gets actually denitrifies before it gets into the groundwater. And we have that in Alachua County too, where part of the county, the aquifer is clean. Luckily, my house is in that part of the county. My well water is at 0.05 nitrate. If you're in Archer, your well water is 1.2 milligrams per liter of nitrate, 20 to 30 times higher than the background. And that's the way it is here. Our bottled water, if it's from this area, has probably got some nitrate in it. Doesn't hurt people, but it causes problems in springs. There's the blow up of Hernando County, and Citrus County and Pasco County. So all the springs along this coast have some contamination. We've seen that graph of the rising nitrate levels. Phosphorus isn't going up in the aquifer. Luckily, the phosphorus in the fertilizer is not getting to the groundwater. It's being trapped, but the nitrate is. 1,500% increase. So when nitrate comes out of a spring and is in the sunlight, it certainly is a plant growth nutrient. You know, it's a fertilizer you use. And in some springs, we're getting incredible algal growth. I think the main thing that's happening is the macrophytes, the plants in the background here, don't like the nitrate. I think it's actually weakening those plants so that the algae it basically takes over. Rather, the algae was there to start with, but it's never been as abundant as it is now, as seen like in Weeki Wachee Springs. So nitrate subsidizes plant growth, algae growth, but not the macrophytes. And at higher concentrations, it stresses these macrophytes. The macrophytes disappear and the algae take over is basically the science of what's happening. Weeki Wachee in the 50s, Weeki Wachee before the vacuum job. And that will come back. This is in Ichtucknee, one of the side springs there. What can we do about this? Well, that's what I've been trying to work up. What is a sustainable amount of water use for the people of Florida? And what's a sustainable amount of nitrogen loading that will allow us to have springs in the future, healthy springs in the future? This is an example with Silver Springs and Rainbow Springs, two very large springs, two of the largest springs in the state. Their groundwater sheds, or spring sheds, are very large. Silver Springs is almost 1,200 square miles. Rainbow Springs is almost 1,000 square miles in area. Those two spring sheds actually almost overlap, and we think that they're actually competing for water right now. But if you take on average, their average flows in the past, it's about 2,000 square miles between them, with a rainfall of 50 inches a year, and the groundwater recharge is about 10 inches a year. The flow between those two springs was averaging about 935 million gallons a day. That's about the total withdrawal right now for the St. Johns River Water Management District. That's about 730 gallons per day per acre of land in those spring sheds. So that tells you how much water is is recharging on average. The estimated decline in those two springs, long-term decline, not just this year, not just this week, but over the last decade, is about 24% decline in those two springs. It's a decline of over 200 million gallons a day. Remember, I indicated that the science indicates that you can measure significant harm. That means you've really harmed the system at a 10% flow reduction. The existing flow reduction in Silver and Rainbow is about 24%. And so what would we have to do in terms of pumping to reduce that harm? If we define that significant harm at 10%, then that would mean of the total 940 million gallons a day, only about 10 20% of that could be pumped. So that would say, of the 2 spring sheds, Silver and Rainbow, the total limit on pumping, not counting what you return, I mean, you deduct that, would be 94 million gallons a day in those 2 spring sheds. And we're estimating right now that over 200 million gallons a day is not just being pumped, actually the actual pumping in those spring sheds is less than 90 million gallons a day as far as we can tell. The problem must also be on the outside of those spring sheds, as well as, of course, partly the drought, but not over that decade period, the drought wasn't as significant. But anyway, this is only about equivalent to 70 gallons per day per acre. And this is what's going in these spring sheds, center pivot irrigation systems with 10, 12-inch wells that can pump 1 million gallons a day by themselves. So we're already past the point of harm to Silver and Rainbow Springs. It's possible we've already passed the point of harm at Weeki Wachee. There is an MFL set for Weeki Wachee. There still is no MFL for Silver and Rainbow that's been set. The water management districts are working on this, but it's unfortunately taking a long time to set it. The nitrate concentrations at those springs, the average for the 2, a flow-weighted average is 1.6 milligrams per liter of nitrate compared to the 0.05 background and the 0.35 standard. This is the standard that springs are being judged on right now, 0.35, and this is almost 5 times higher than that. That would mean to get to that standard, and both these springs, Rainbow and Silver, have been found to be impaired by the state, and they're developing total maximum daily loads that were discussed by the previous speaker. You're going to need over a 70% reduction in the nitrogen loading in those spring sheds. 70% less nitrogen is going to have to go on the ground in the form of fertilizer, animal manure, and human wastewater. So these are our current land use practices. They're not sustainable in light of healthy springs. If we put too many golf courses out, and golf courses are heavily fertilized, if too much irrigated grass and landscape and plants out, if we can't do farming the way we used to with less water, we're not going to have healthy springs. And the same thing's true with really intense land management of any kind that releases nitrate. You can't have a sustainable landscape. And in Florida, where you go to find a spring that's not contaminated with nitrate is the Ocala National Forest. Basically a forested area, doesn't have nitrate in the groundwater. So if we all converted our lawns to trees, we wouldn't have to mow, and we wouldn't have to fertilize, and we wouldn't have to irrigate. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I know it's not going to happen. But that's what it will actually take to go back to more of a pristine type landscape with the number of people we have. This is something that farmers can do. You don't make as much money off a longleaf pine plantation as you do from a irrigated cornfield right now with ethanol prices the way they are. You make a lot more money. But what's the cost to the public of somebody making that extra money in terms of lost natural resources? That's what we're all paying for when people increase their water use and their nitrogen use for profit. We're all paying for that because we're losing the public's resource, the commons, the public's commons, the springs basically in the groundwater. You can clean up wastewater by going to a wetland. And we have a lot of these municipal wetland systems in the state of Florida. This is one that has no surface discharge. All the water is recycled into the groundwater. This is actually in Palm Beach County, the Green Cay wetlands. But this is a technology that can be used anywhere in Florida to at least provide a better way to treat our municipal wastewaters so that we do recharge the aquifers with water, but the water's clean when it goes into the ground. We've taken the nitrate out of the water by doing that. So it just turns out that wetlands and forests be the greenest way to go. I know we're not going to do it wholesale. This is a large wetland system up in Atlanta. The Clayton County, just adjacent to Atlanta, didn't run out of water when Atlanta ran out, when they pulled Lake Lanier down, because Clayton County was recycling all their wastewater through a wetland that then put it back in their drinking water reservoir. So they weren't wasting that water, they were recycling it. And we all do recycle our water. Do we want to put clean water into the aquifer or continue to put dirty water in the aquifer? And right now the standards aren't high enough to protect the aquifer from being contaminated by nitrate. So these are some, this looks like Florida from the 1500s, and I'm not trying to make it that way. I really think that we can have 19 million people in Florida and do a much better job of protecting our groundwater and our springs. But we need to reduce the nitrogen load while we protect the flow. And we have these government programs to do this, minimum flows and levels, and we have surface water and groundwater criteria. We actually, our state laws allow for this protection now. They're just not being enforced the way they need to be by our water management districts and by our Department of Environmental Protection. And I guess I'm the one that can say that here. Minimum flow is supposed to be established for all these major springs, and they're not. We're still way behind in establishing minimum flows for springs. But once again, a minimum flow says, we're going to let you pump as much water as you can down to the point where we're causing significant harm to the resource. That's basically what a minimum flow is. Instead of saying, what's an optimum flow for our springs, let's talk about an optimum flow rather than a minimum flow. Groundwater is protected from contamination, like the nitrate. That map I showed you of nitrate contamination, that is illegal in the state of Florida. Nobody has sued the state over that problem yet. But people are thinking about it. And basically the Florida law says you will not create nuisance conditions because of groundwater contamination or impair reasonable and beneficial uses. And that's what's happening to our springs. We're fortunate to have these springs. In South Florida, they don't have springs, so they can't see what the results of their effects on the groundwater are. It's not as visible to them as it is to us. Our springs are giving us an early warning that things are getting bad in our groundwater and we need to do something about it. So private citizens, every one of us is guilty of these problems. Every one of us, including myself. I drink water, I have a well, I have a septic tank. But every one of us can use less water and we can use less fertilizer. Those are the two things we can do best. And then every one of us can speak up to our elected officials that we want these laws to be enforced. And we don't want private people to have private gain at the expense of the public good. And that's what I think we need to do. There's things our government needs to do better in terms of delineating what areas are recharging these springs, really telling everybody how much water is actually available for pumping. This is not something you'll hear at a water management district governing board meeting, is, well, we've got a cap. It's only 94 million gallons a day on Silver, in the spring shed of Silver and Rainbow. I came up with that number. They didn't come up with that number, and I don't think they would use that number. What they're doing is they're issuing one permit after another for consumptive uses, and their model's telling them that everything's fine, everything's fine. And they keep adding those permits in, but they never say, when's the last permit going to be? When's the last time somebody's going to get a new permit? And so nobody really knows how much water can be taken out of the aquifer. That's something that our governing boards need to do for us, is let us know what's the cap that we're going to draw on this that will keep these springs from going into significant harm. So I'm sorry, I'm a preacher, if you will, about springs, but I am passionate about them. I grew up with healthy springs. I went to Silver Springs in 1953 for the first time. I've seen healthy springs, I've worked in them. I know what it would take to get them back, and I just don't see the people of Florida understanding it enough to actually take action to protect our shared resource. So thank you for listening.